Did you know that there are 4 layers of WordPress caching? Let's look at the typical requests to see how they all fit together. We have a user coming to our site, right? What they're actually hitting is our web server. So our web server will be either Nginx or Apache. So that's here on the right. This is the request coming in here. Now, what Nginx or Apache does is then it talks to PHP. In case of Apache, you could have PHP actually bundled with the Apache web server, but in most instances, for at least the performance setups, you would have PHP as a standalone FPM or fast process manager type of application that runs by that web server. Now, in addition to PHP, we also have the WordPress core files, right? So something where the PHP process is actually going to reach out for the application logic. And in this case, that is the WordPress files. And then when WordPress needs to fetch some data, it does so from the database. So we have these layers here. So let's look at example. What happens if I call get post 1 2 times? So that's a typical scenario. Imagine you have a query as the main query of a site, and then you have featured posts, latest posts, a block on the sidebar, for example. So this could easily, it's actually the same idea here, this could easily happen. Well, it turns out WordPress by default has an in-memory object cache. So the first thing we have is object cache in memory. So what does that mean? That means if we look at the code for the get post, this is the definition of the get post. It checks for the current global post object, right? That's where it could be cached for the current request. But if it's not defined, then it actually reaches out to the WP posts class instance and attempts to retrieve it from there. And notice that the first thing it does, it actually calls WP cache get. And that is the object cache. It's one of the methods that needs to be defined by the object cache. Now, let's look at what it actually does behind the scenes. Now, notice that this is a cache.php file. So this cache definition is actually that runtime cache. And that global object is just an instance of the WP object cache. That is a class that just has some properties. So in this case, that's an array where you can store and retrieve any arbitrary data by key and value. So this is what I mean by in memory, because it does not persist between the requests. Here is that get method on that class. All it does essentially is attempts to retrieve this instance from the cache. Notice the group feature that is specific to the object cache here. And the idea is that if you have similar data that is somehow linked to each other and you want to invalidate all of those associated items with it. So the answer to our question of what happens when the get post is called 2 times in a row is that the first time it's actually going to reach out to the WP posts query, in this case here, retrieve the post, and the second time it's going to do the other loop is where it has persisted that data in that array and it's going to retrieve it there. Now, the second option here is that you actually replace this in-memory feature with a persisted object cache or external object cache. And for that, we can use key value stores, external key value stores such as Memcached, that's a typical one, or Redis. They're very similar to the post options, post meta tables or the options tables, that they are key value stores. The keys are arbitrary, the values are arbitrary as well. The only requirement is obviously that they don't conflict or override each other. A popular implementation of this is the WP Memcached plugin. All it does is it has this object cache.php file, and that is the one that WordPress core is looking for when it attempts to resolve it from the contents directory. So if you want to use a plugin like this, it is your responsibility to actually either symlink, so create a symbolic link in a sense of file system feature, or you can actually create a virtual include, right? So you can have an object the object cache.php in your WP contents folder, and all it does is it requires in or includes in this object cache from this integration that your server is supporting. And then if we look at this file, it is basically a replica of this file here, which is the definition of these methods plus the actual instance of the cache storage retrieval class. Notice here that the methods are almost replicated, but then the unique features are all part of this. When it wants to retrieve or get any data from these stores, it uses the dedicated APIs, either that's a PHP extension or some kind of other integration, but that's basically contained within this class. So we have the second object cache, which is persisted or external. In this diagram, the object cache sits between WordPress and the database. Now, every time WordPress needs to get something from the database, or anything really, it could be external API as well, it would then have the opportunity to use these cache helper functions to retrieve and get the data and persist it in the memory, or in the second option here, actually in this external data store. The third one that we have is called advanced cache. The advanced cache would be sitting here between the web server and the PHP. Almost. So let's look at what I mean. So a few lines above this start object cache integration, we have this conditional. So if the WP cache constant is defined and this advanced cache.php, again, another magical file. So let's write it down here. We had object cache.php, and now we have, I don't want that to be a link, advanced cache.php, and these are under the WP contents folder. WP content here, right? These two, that was just an example, we can get rid of it. Now, the advanced cache works in a similar way. It just includes this file, and this file then can do anything, really. So let's look at an example of an advanced cache.php. And one such implementation relying on the same Memcached backend is called Batcache. It was at some point used on WordPress.com. Maybe it is still used, I don't know. But notice that in a similar fashion here, it has the advanced -cache file, and that is where that logic lives. There is this class which gets instantiated within the same file here. So notice that it defines it there, then it creates an instance of itself, and then it does some bootstrap checks and verifications whether that request actually can be cached or not. So in this case, it will allow caching only head and get requests, which are the typical ones. Also, it will never cache anything that does cookies, right? So it means if a cookie is present, most likely PHP needs to process the request to generate a response that is unique to that user instead of being a generic one. And then it does the same thing, verifies that if a persisted object cache is present, this is not 100% required. The advanced cache could exist without the object cache. They're not linked together. And then it calls the cache init. But the reason that this integration actually relies on that object cache is because it uses the object cache for storing the whole response generated by the PHP. And that happens at the very end here. Notice that it calls ob start, so it starts output buffering, and everything returned by the PHP process will then be captured by this ob method from the Batcache instance. So this ob method is the callback that gets called when the output buffer is been flushed or rendered. And then when that happens, it collects all these headers for the requests that have been generated by the PHP response. They're being stored, and then it is being returned to the user as well. So in essence, there is a very trivial way of collecting all the generated PHP response data. As I said, strings all the way, cache it in the same object persisted store, either Redis or Batcache. Any kind of backend really works for this. One of the most used implementations of this is the WP Supercache, which instead of writing this to memory or to an external store, is actually writing it to the file system. And the nice thing about this implementation is that it works with most of the hosts. Now, the final bonus one is actually something that is not handled or wouldn't be handled by WordPress itself. That is the full page cache. This is also full page cache, advanced cache. At the server level here. So we're not going to go into a detail of how this is usually set up, but in essence, in a similar fashion, how we are capturing that request response from PHP and then serving it to the users, we can also do the same thing at the Nginx or Apache level. So this was an overview of the 4 caching methods that are available on WordPress setups. I hope you enjoyed this. If you want to learn more about this, I'm going to be going into much more detail at the Modern WordPress Fast Track course. So if you're interested into that, go to the landing page, subscribe to the newsletter, and you'll also get additional videos like this delivered to your inbox. I hope you have a great day.